But one of those things that we need to do before we get to ripping and stripping and putting wood on a boat here is we need some forms to build a boat around. Now, I am a cheap New England Yankee, there's no doubt about it, so I am using very inexpensive, like $10 a sheet stranded particle board here. And the forms that you will get from us, they will have center lines on them and nice heavy dark lines, and you just need to cut around them with a jigsaw, and we'll get to that in just a second. This is for Boston Rowing Whitehall, a little racer, and before we're done working with this, we need to get it ready for the strong back, and in order to put it to the strong back, we need to put a buttress block on it. Now, the buttress block is just a standard piece of 2x4. It's 12 inches wide, and the reason for that is because the top of our strong back is 12 inches wide. It gives us a nice solid place so that we can screw down and hold that form down. I am going to ring a bell throughout this whole DVD talking about center lines. You need to really pay attention when I do that because the center lines are critical. We're going to make center lines on forms, center lines on strong backs, center lines on buttresses. We're going to have center lines going up the middle so that we align forms. And if you pay attention every time I mention that center line and you do what I do, you're not going to have any problems at all building this boat. But if you don't and you get halfway through the boat and then you realize you didn't line up some center lines, then you're going to have some issues and you're going to have to give me a call and we're going to have to deal with it then. But let's assume that you're going to pay attention because right now I'm going to talk about the first center line. All right, so I have my buttress block. I have a center line going all the way around this particular block. I have a center line on my form. So what I'm going to do is line the two of them up here, and I'm going to make sure that this buttress block is right flat up against the bottom of the form, as flat as I can be. And I am going to line them up right there in the middle. And I'm going to put some screws down through it. Right now I've got 3.5 inch screws. Everything's lined up. You can see here in the end that I have the lines from the form lined up with the buttress block. And I'm just going to screw them right down. Now, when you put your screws in here, you're going to want to stay away from that center line because we're going to be using that center line on the form to line up to the strong back. So I'm going to keep my screw well off of that. Yeah. All right, so we're going to end up doing this to all of the forms so that when we screw them down the form and the strong back, it just goes right down the boat, and these are what we're going to use to actually attach our wood or strips to in this particular boat. All right. Now, something that I left off the last DVD, kind of wish I hadn't. I didn't explain to people how to take patterns and turn them into forms. I just assumed that everybody would know how to do that, and that was a mistake. Because it turns out people were using everything from tracing paper to little tiny nails and battens, and really it's not anywhere near that difficult. I have here the form for the transom for our boat. Very sleek boat, comes down to a very small transom. And on that transom, you're going to see that I have marked here, which is the shear line, and going all the way down here, I have a red block for this particular boat. That means that's where the inner skeg bedding is going to be, and you'll know more about that as we go along. But for right now, all we're talking about is how we're going to actually make this. Now, again, wanting to save a few dollars here, I have a piece of mahogany marine plywood 3/4 inches thick. I have that because we just finished building an 18-foot dory, and that's what we use for the bottom of it in transom, and this would be absolutely perfect for the transom for this boat. Now, this is a very traditional boat, probably 170 years old in its original design. So originally what you would do is you would take this form and you would actually frame it out with steam bent wood and then cover the back. You can do that, and if you want to do that, give me a call. I'll tell you how to get that done. But right now, all I'm going to do is take some marine plywood and cut it out, because ultimately, Whitehalls were meant to be painted anyway, and they're meant to be painted white, and usually with a stripe of a color that represents the boat builder. And we will be painting ours white in the traditional color. So I am going to go ahead and adhere this down. Now here's what I didn't tell people last time that I really wish I had. Very inexpensive can of 3M Super 77 carpet glue. That's it, that's the trick. All you're going to do is, after you rough cut the paper for your forms, make a few marks so that you know where you're going to be putting the glue. Move it out of the way, and then spray some glue down. This is a really simple process. There we go. Now, when you're working with the bigger forms, it's probably going to be handy if you got a second pair of hands around. So you want to make sure that when you put the paper down, you don't have crinkles in it. So you're going to lay it out. If you've ever done laminate work, you know it's really important that you basically only have a single shot to get it down. All right, so that is it. So what we have now is a paper pattern. Now the pattern I just showed you on the other form, you probably noticed there was wrinkles and crinkles in the paper. Reason for that is this is a working shop. At night it gets down, this time of year it might get down to 40 degrees. During the day it might get up to 75 degrees, so it gets hot and cold and hot and cold and hot and cold, and the paper gets wrinkled. You've got plenty of time to put this down, get everything cut out before you have to worry about any of that. Do not pull the paper off when you're done, because you might end up needing that while you're building the boat. The inner form's not so much, but the transom, it's got center lines and shear lines marked on it, and you're going to find that really helpful as we go through this process. And as we get closer, I'll show you why that's so helpful. So that's it. From here, if you're going to do it in a jigsaw, get a fine tooth finish blade. Go around it. If you're doing it on your bandsaw, same thing. If you don't feel that you can cut the line, then cut proud of the line and then sand it. Take a sander and sand it down flush to the line all the way around. The only thing that you do need to do while doing all this is you have to make a decision if you're going to be cutting proud of the line or taking the line. I am always a big fan of cutting proud of the line and then sanding up to the line so that you can actually see the black line all the way around. That way there you know you're not making any mistakes. If you're the kind of person that likes to cut the line, then when you're done, you really have no point of reference to make sure that you didn't go too far. So I cut a little bit proud of the line and I take a sander and finish it off. All right, so that's it. It's a real simple process. I'm glad I got it on this DVD. If you're going to use a jigsaw, make sure you get a nice fine blade. All right, so from here, I'll take care of this a little bit later. I'm going to go down, I'm going to show you how to steam around the stem form so that we can start to get that ready for a couple of days from when we start to put it all together. All right, DVDs past, you know, we really try, we got a big shop here and it's got all kinds of neat stuff in it. But when we do the DVDs, we try to make sure that we stay in the realm of the home builder. In DVDs past, in order to steam things, we've used a tea kettle with a simple piece of PVC pipe stuck over the end of the tea kettle and the wood, put up the PVC and steam, okay? And that works fine. This is an alternative method that you might have in your house. What we heard from people is getting electric tea kettles isn't as easy as it used to be. So fine, I can shift with that. So what we have here is your basic Stanley Power steamer, which is used to strip wallpaper. Built a very simple little box here, and remember you want to keep things small because the bigger the area, the more steam you have to create in order to do some steaming, and for what we're doing, we just don't need that much. So this is a little box. You could do this out of a piece of PVC pipe with a T in the middle, and if you do that, just make sure you put air holes on the end so that the steam can get out, or else it'll create kind of a mess for you. So we've created this little box. And in this box you can see these holes where we just stuck a piece of dowel through it and we plugged it up with some caulking, and that gives us a place to lay these on. Now these are the 1/2 inch by 3/4 inch inner and outer stem. I need to steam these so that we can get it to bend nicely around the stem over there, and I'm going to do that right now. The general rule of thumb is for every 1/4 inch of this hardwood you're going to want to let it steam for at least 15 minutes. I usually let it go about 20. And then it'll bend really nice and easy around that form. All right, so I'm going to take this and put it inside the steamer, and be careful because steam is hot. So you want to make sure you don't get yourself in trouble there. And then I'm going to go grab a screw gun and screw this down so that the steam's in there. And I'm going to leave this alone for about 25 minutes, 20 minutes or so. And I'm going to meet you over by the stem form, and I'll show you how we bend that right around. All right, so I'm going to do all my stand up and my talking right now, because once you grab the wood out of the steamer and you bring it over here, you got about 30, 45 seconds of really good working time. And I don't want to be wasting that talking to you. So let me give you an idea what's going to happen here. This is the stem form, okay? And you can see that I've drilled a 2-inch hole all the way around here. I put one every few inches, and we're going to use that so that we can use our C-clamps, all right? The end result that we're going for here, I've already done a couple for this particular boat, and these are going to bend right around here, and we're going to clamp them down. Now you have to do this in a couple of stages. These have already been glued. This is the inner and the outer stem, and they've already been glued up. You know, problem is you can't epoxy glue something that's wet. So you're going to put them on here, and you're going to leave them for at least 24 hours to let them dry out. I would prefer you left them for 72 hours. Make sure they're good and dry before you start putting epoxy on them, because if the wood's wet and you try to epoxy, it's going to delaminate on you. You don't want to do that. So if you're in a really dry environment, 24 hours is probably going to be fine. If you're not in a really dry environment, then you need to let it go a little bit longer to let it get back to the ambient moisture, okay? So I'm about ready to go grab that wood. We're not going to do a lot of talking during that because time is of the essence. If you have an extra pair of hands that can help you out with this, go ahead and grab them, because it'll make it a whole lot easier if somebody's holding one end while you're working the other one, putting on the C-clamp. Notice the gloves. Again, want to reiterate, steam is hot. When you go and grab that wood, it's going to be awfully warm. Highly recommend that you have a pair of gloves on, and if you don't, you're going to have to really work fast. So I don't recommend that at all. Get yourself some kind of decent working gloves that you can work with that are very, tactile, that you can still work with. Grab the wood, put the C-clamps on, and it'll all go really smooth. So I'm going to go over and grab the wood and show you how we clamp that right down. Okay, well, I got the boys out of the steam box, and you're going to see that these are going to bend right around. Nice and easy, just like it's made out of soft lead. All right, so line them up. We got them hanging over the edge here, about 1.5 inches or so. Take yourself a C-clamp and clamp it down. You're going to have to work quick here, because your best bending time is in the first few seconds. So every form's a little bit different, but for this particular boat, it's a nice, easy, sweeping curve, which means I can go right down here, put a clamp right at the other end. And I'm going to do just that. Helps if you set the clamps to just about the right depth before you started, especially if you're working alone. Okay, yeah. Now I'm going to go ahead and just throw a couple of clamps in here, make sure I stay, nice and close to the curve. Like I said, depending on the boat, you may not be able to do it just the way that I just did it. You may have to start here and walk it around to make sure that when you put these in here, what you don't want is have a big bubble in the middle here, right? You want it to stay nice and tight all the way around. So if you bend it around and you see there's a space here, then don't clamp it here. Clamp it here, and just walk it right in, all right? So I'm going to throw just a couple more clamps on here. And then we are going to move on to something else and give this a little while to dry up before we put glue to it. And there you go. So I'll let that set. The one thing I guess I would say about this is I get emails and phone calls from people saying, Jack, you don't really need to steam that. You can just make these strips a little bit thinner, stack a few more of them together, and then it'll bend around without steaming them. That may or may not be true, but I have a couple issues with that. First, you don't want to crack this wood. And by the way, if you're steaming it and you hear a crack, stop, throw it out, and start again. Because if you hear a small crack now, it's for sure going to crack on you when you get it on the boat, and that's the worst possible time that it could happen. So for the few dollars worth of wood here, just go ahead and cut yourself some new pieces, all right? Second, if you do that and you use thinner strips and you laminate 2 or 3 times as many together, the problem is if you use the epoxy glue, which most people are going to use, they're going to mix up some epoxy that we're going to show you how to do that later. Epoxy by itself is extremely brittle. It's an outstanding glue. Typically the wood will break long before the glue joint will break, but if you have lots and lots and lots of thin layers of epoxy, it becomes very, very brittle. So you really don't want to do that. It's the wood that has the give when all is said and done, not the epoxy. All right, so I don't recommend doing it that way. I know a lot of you are going to do it anyway. My recommendation is, you know, the little steamer that we have going over there, I think it cost me $38 at Home Depot. All right, and we have bigger steam boxes for doing bigger things, but this is all you need for these Whitehall boats. Just this itty bitty little steam box over here. You can build a whole thing for less than $100 for sure. All right, gonna let that dry. Let's go do some other stuff. Okay, so I decided in order to show you how to glue up some of these laminations that we would do it on this, the inner skeg bedding here. And you're just gonna have to, if you've never done one of these boats before, you're just gonna have to trust me that that's an actual thing. And when we get to building the boat, you're gonna see exactly what that is. Gluing up these laminations, whether we're doing it for this or whether we're doing it for the inner and outer stem pieces, is absolutely identical. The only difference is on this one we only have the inner section to do, where on the stems we have the inner and the outer. So where I'm going to show you how to glue these up, you would go ahead and put another piece of blue tape and do the second one. I'll talk about that when we get there. I made the mistake in a couple of our other DVDs of getting real specific on how to mix the epoxy. And then what happened is we had some customers that bought epoxy that we didn't sell, that was treated very differently, and they got into some trouble. So I'm going to be a little bit more generic this time around, and if you get it from us, you'll certainly get all the information that you need to do the epoxy. But whoever you get it from, make sure that it's somebody you can talk to and find out, you know, exactly how to use the stuff. All epoxies are not the same. They don't use the same formula. Some are blushing, some are non-blushing, some are fast, some are slow. Where we tend to give our customers the same stuff all the time so that they can get used to it and regulate it. Some people go and just buy whatever they have at the store. What I will say is this, though. If anybody tells you that you can use polyester resin to do this because it's cheaper, they're wrong. They're absolutely wrong. Polyester resin is a wonderful thing. They make fiberglass boats out of it, but it's a horrible, horrible, horrible glue. It doesn't glue well at all. So don't use polyester resin. I understand it's very inexpensive, but don't use the stuff. All right, so I have been mixing, and the key to mixing epoxy is to mix, 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 mix. And when you think it's done, mix it a little bit more. And I'm going to show you now how to do a good glue joint using epoxy. And this doesn't just apply to laminations that we're doing, it applies to any glue joint that you're doing, whether you're building a plywood boat or one of these boats that are wood strip. Okay, so on my particular resin and hardener, I am using a 2-to-1 ratio, and what that means is 2 parts resin to 1 part hardener. And for the most part, most of you out there are going to be using slow. Unless you've done this before and you're really, really comfortable working with epoxy, slow is a better way to go. It takes a little bit longer to cure, but it gives you a lot more pot life to work with. You're going to see that I got a form here, and excuse me. Again, this came with the plans, and it's a template for doing the inner skeg bed. And you can see here that it's got the form numbers written right down. So it gives you an idea where you're at. So I made this form same way that we did the transom, and then cut it out. I'm not worried about cutting the bottom because we're not laminating there. I don't really need to worry about that. And it tells me right on that in order to do this, I need 1/2 inch by 3/4, and I need 2 of them laminated together. So we're going to go ahead and do that. You always do them a little bit long, 1 inch or so on either side, so that you can trim it up, because chances are you're not going to get it dead even anyway. So in order to get a good glue joint, you start with just the epoxy resin and the hardener, and you give it a coat. Go right on down and give it a coat. I should also say you should have gloves on, because you don't want to get this stuff on your skin. Not too many people have an allergic reaction to it, but I mean, it's epoxy, and there's really no reason to be getting that on your skin. You want to be liberal but neat. You don't want it dripping all over the place, but you want to make sure that there's enough there so that the wood can soak it right up. And give it a nice coat all the way down. All right, so I got one done. And I'm going to set that aside for a second. And I'm going to take another one. I'm going to do exactly the same thing. Now the deal is, epoxy, although typically referred to when laminating up boats and fiberglassing, is an unbelievably stout glue. Once these are properly glued together, if I tried ripping them apart, there is an extremely good chance that they're not going to rip apart at the glue joint, and it would be the actual wood that would give away long before the glue. So you got to make sure that when you do this, you're paying attention and you do it right. Because once it's together, if it's wrong, you're basically starting over again. So I'm giving it a nice coat. I'll let all that soak in. I'm just using a little inexpensive acid brush here. When I'm done, everything gets thrown away, except for the cup. What I do is I always set the cup aside that's got the epoxy in it. Two reasons. First, I want to make sure that the epoxy cured well, and the best way to do that is to leave it sitting in the cup. And second, it's a lot easier to clean up once it's hardened. Okay, so I got a coat on each side. Epoxy is also a wonderful filler. So I got a little bit of wood flour here, and if you got a kit from us, whether it's an epoxy kit or a full kit or a partial kit, you got some of this as well. I just take the wood flour, put it in there as a thickener, and stir it up. And what you're looking for is the consistency of like a little bit runnier than a creamy peanut butter. And what that will do is I make this glue joint, any gaps that may exist in there, it'll go ahead and fill those for me. Alright, so I got all that mixed up. So what I'm going to do now is go back and take that bottom piece, and I'm going to spread the thickened epoxy right on top. Okay, you're going to notice on top of that form that we have sitting there, we have blue painter's tape. Should be obvious to you why we're doing that. If we don't, there's a real good chance that the laminations will get stuck one to the other, and no good can come of that. So we take them, get them close, and I've drilled these holes close enough so that I can just take a spring clamp and clamp it right on there. Alright, now I'm going to go right down and do that all the way down. Alright, so it's as simple as that. Just walk right down clamping it. Now what you need to know about epoxy is it's not like yellow glue, where the more you clamp it, the harder you clamp it, the better it is. Epoxy is actually not the opposite, but has a different philosophy. Its job is to glue itself to itself and to penetrate the wood. So the last thing in the world you want to do is squeeze it all out. That would be a bad thing. So these little finger clamps or spring clamps are plenty. The thing you need to know with epoxy is never put off till later what you can do now when it comes to cleaning it up. Because it is a whole lot easier to wipe it off with a paper towel now than it will be to sand it down later. It is very, very hard glue. Okay, so that's it. These are done. I'm going to take a paper towel, clean along the edges to make it really simple to sand it down, clean it up later. Just make sure you got enough holes along the side and clamps along the side to get a nice union all the way down. That's simple. All right, so again, the only difference between this and the stems that we showed you steaming up, that are still drying, is if I were going to do another layer on top of this, before I clamped it, I would put a piece of blue tape on top of this piece right here, and then I would go ahead and do another set right on top, clamp them all together. Now, you know, you can do them separately. I recommend doing one on top of the other when it comes to the stems especially. Let me show you. Okay, the reason I do one on top of the other is you're going to see that these fit one on top of the other. So when we put them on the boat, it'll be a nice fit. And in fact, if I put one up side by side, They're just a little bit different. You can see the angles go off a little bit differently because one of them, you know, was built on top of the other. So I really prefer it if people would do that because you'll get a much tighter fit along your stem line. All right. Okay, we're gonna let this dry because we gotta go set up a strong back and everything, but I got one more thing that I wanted to show you here. This is the transom form that you saw we put the paper on and cut out, and it's all cut out now. All right. In the plans, there should be a pattern for a jig. Now this transom doesn't mount straight up and down. It mounts at an angle. This particular one is about a 14-degree angle. You can see on the paper pattern here that on the side it shows you what it wants in between. This says 1 by 5 by 3.5, which is a 2 by 4 by 10 inches. So I've got 2 of them in there, one here and one here, that are 10 inches wide. Okay. You'll also note that I have a center line going right down the middle of this. Right? Told you I was going to tell you when we talked about center lines, this is one of those points. You need that center line. That center line is going to mount up with the strong back, and it's going to mount up with the form, try to make everything nice and even. So the pattern's the same thing, just put it on a piece of, I used 3/4 inch plywood here. Matter of fact, it was used stuff lying around the shop. Put it on, cut it out, and do whatever it tells you to do. So that when we're done and that goes on the strong back, this simply mounts right on top of it, and it'll be just the right height for this particular boat. And you're gonna see why that's important in just a few minutes, all right? So got a few other things we gotta do to get some housekeeping done before we start building a boat. So hang with me, we're getting there, we're getting closer, but we gotta get a strong back built, and we gotta get some forms mounted, and let's go do some of that right now, okay?